On the morning of my granddaughter's baptism, I pressed my dress twice. I had laid it out the night before, pale lavender with a scalloped hem, the same one I wore at my daughter's wedding. I tied a cream shawl over my shoulders and clipped in the pearl earrings my late husband gave me the day our first grandchild was born. I left early so I wouldn't be in the way. I've always believed in being the quiet presence, never the spectacle. The church was full of light. Morning filtered through stained glass windows, painting soft patterns across the pews. I found a spot near the front, left side, not too close, not too far, and folded my hands in my lap, listening to the hum of laughter and heels against stone. I watched my daughter, Ava, flutter from one guest to another, smiling, her hands full of ceremony and pride. She looked radiant. I waited for her to see me. When the usher handed out the printed programs, I opened mine with the smallest of smiles. I was expecting nothing grand, just a mention. Perhaps the child's grandmother would receive a mention. I looked for my name slowly, line by line, down the list of family members participating in the service. Godparents. Uncles. Even Ava's stepmother, Trish, who's only been in the picture a decade, had a line beneath her name, "Readings by Trish, Ava's bonus mom." But there was no mention of me. I was not even mentioned in the acknowledgments. The acknowledgments contained not a single line mentioning me. Not even Mary Carson in the corner. I'm Mary Carson. I'm 72 years old. And that was the moment I knew they had quietly erased me. I didn't cry. I didn't even frown. I closed the program and folded it back along the crease, placed it neatly in my lap. The organ started to play, and people stood. I rose with them, hands still steady. But something inside me shifted in a way I can't fully explain. It was as if a final thread had snapped in the invisible tapestry I'd spent my life weaving, always quietly, always in the background. She didn't glance in my direction that day. Not once. And after the service, as guests gathered outside for photos and refreshments, I walked to the side of the church and stood near the hedges, where the bees were humming in the white blossoms. I watched her cradle her daughter, my granddaughter, in front of the camera, smiling like she had everything she'd ever wanted. And maybe she did. Just not me. There's a kind of amnesia that comes with comfort, the way people forget the hands that held them once they've learned to stand on their own. I never asked to be remembered loudly. I didn't need my name carved into stones or printed in programs. But I did think after all I'd done I might be worth a line. When Ava was born, it snowed. February of 1983. The roads were a mess, and her father, Paul, was out of town on a conference he couldn't get out of. I drove her to the hospital myself when the contractions got too close together. She was only 21. Still called me mommy sometimes when she was half asleep. I sat in the labor room all night. Held her hair back. Rubbed her spine with a tennis ball like the nurse showed me. Whispered every word I could find to make her believe she was stronger than the pain. And when Ava finally held her baby girl for the first time, I stepped back, swallowed my joy, and let the room shine on her. That's the thing about motherhood. You give and give, and when the giving is done, you become the shadow in the doorway, present, but quiet. Always quiet. I remember the little things, the thankless ones. Like the year Ava and her husband almost lost their house. Interest rates spiked. The mortgage ballooned. She didn't tell me outright, but I saw the red notices in the drawer when I was helping babysit. I offered to pay 3 months. She said she couldn't accept it. I left a check under the butter dish anyway. I baked birthday cakes even when my hands started shaking. I sewed a Halloween cape with arthritic fingers, threading a needle under a magnifying glass because my granddaughter wanted to be a night witch, and the store-bought costumes were too scratchy. I watched their dog when they went to California for 10 days. He was half blind and chewed through my lovely drapes, but I never mentioned it. I watched him again 2 months later. And when Ava got shingles last winter and couldn't pick the baby up for days, I came over with soup, tucked her in, and changed diapers even when my knees were burning from standing too long. I don't say these things out loud. Never have. That's the problem with being the quiet, dependable kind. People think it's easy for you. But there were moments that cost me. Paul died in 2012. He suffered a sudden cardiac arrest. I was 59. We'd just come back from a trip to Niagara Falls, our first real vacation in years. In an instant, he vanished. There were no final words exchanged. No final squeeze of the hand. One moment we were watching the falls churn in moonlight, and the next, I was a widow. Ava grieved. She cried at the funeral, leaned into me like she did when she was little. And for a few weeks, she checked in every morning. But time moved on. And I didn't want to be a burden. So I stayed quiet. I never asked to move in. I never requested assistance with the broken gutter or the icy walkway. I paid for a man to come shovel my drive because I didn't want Ava to think I was helpless. Even when I broke my wrist falling on that same ice. She sent a card. It said, "Feel better soon, Grandma." She quickly signed the card. No visit. No call. I told myself she was busy with the baby. I kept a notebook for a while, little things I wanted to remember. First words. First holidays. I experienced the pain of losing my first teeth. I thought maybe one day I'd put it all into a scrapbook for her daughter. But the notebook's still half empty, tucked into the drawer with my passport and Paul's watch. I'm not sure I'll finish it now. Love changes shape as you get older. It becomes quieter. Less visible. It lives in reminders, in practical acts. Filling the fridge before they visit. Checking the oil in their car. They were quietly seated in the fourth pew. Maybe they didn't see those things. Or maybe they did, and they just stopped counting. Either way, by the time I sat in that church and found my name missing, I realized something had shifted. Somewhere between carpool pickups and casserole drop-offs, I had stopped being a person in their story and become a piece of the background. And the truth is, I let it happen. I made it easy for them to forget. But forgetting has a price. They just didn't know what it would be yet. There's no sound when love fades. No crash, no scream, no slamming door. It slips out the side, polite as a breeze, while the rest of the house carries on. That's how it happened with Ava and me. Not all at once. Not in a single cruel act. Just 100 little moments that barely registered to them, but scraped something raw in me. It started with the phone calls. I used to hear from Ava every Sunday. Like clockwork, she'd call after the groceries were put away. We'd talk about her week, the baby's teething, her work schedule. I didn't say much, just listened, encouraged, gave her space to unspool her thoughts. That rhythm carried us for years. Then the calls became every other week. Then once a month. Then only when she needed something. I remember once, I think it was the spring before last. I hadn't heard from her in 6 weeks. I debated calling. I even picked up the phone twice. But I didn't press her number. I told myself she'd reach out when she had time. When she wasn't so tired. But deep down, I knew. I wasn't at the center anymore. I'd become a task. A checkbox. An obligation that lingered in the corner of her to-do list. Birthdays got quieter. She used to call first thing in the morning. Then it became a late-night text. One year, I got a Facebook message with a gif of a cake. No words. Just the animation of candles flickering on a screen. I didn't respond. I wasn't sure what to say to a gif. And then there was the Christmas that really lingered. They invited me, of course. They always did. I came with homemade cranberry bread, wrapped in cloth, tied with twine like I used to when Ava was a girl. She used to love that smell. Cinnamon and orange zest. But when I arrived, no one looked up. The baby was screaming, the dog was barking, and Ava was in the kitchen, shouting something to her husband about batteries. I stood in the doorway for nearly 5 minutes before she even realized I was there. "Oh, you made it," she said, almost like I was a surprise. I set the bread down on the counter and tried not to feel the sting in my chest. They had new traditions now. Matching pajamas. A morning scavenger hunt. A special brunch that Trish prepared, gluten-free, dairy-free, sugar-free. My cranberry bread sat untouched until it quietly disappeared, likely tossed in the bin when no one was looking. I stayed for 2 hours that day. I took a photo with the baby in front of the tree, but I wasn't in the group shots. They were taken later, I was told, when I'd already left. Ava never sent me a copy of the photo we took. I imagine it's still on her phone, buried somewhere beneath screenshots and recipes and texts that don't include me. I didn't say anything. I never do. That's the role I learned to play. The agreeable mother. The quiet grandmother. The one who doesn't take up space. But inside, I was becoming hollow. Like a room you forget to heat. Even the way they spoke changed. Ava started calling me Mom less and Mary more. I don't know when it started. Maybe she thought it sounded more grown-up. More respectful, somehow. But hearing my name from her lips felt colder than any silence. I was her mother. I raised her. I gave her my body, my breath, my whole youth. And yet now I was just Mary. She never introduced me at gatherings anymore. I'd show up, smile, bring a gift, and sit quietly as she flitted from one friend to another. Once, at a neighborhood barbecue, someone asked who I was. Ava laughed and said, "Oh, that's just my mom, she likes to float in the background." That word, just, it stayed with me. Just the babysitter. Just the helper. Just the old woman who brings the pie and leaves before dessert is served. There's something about being quietly excluded that changes you. It makes you doubt your memories. Were we ever close? Did I imagine the warmth? Were those bedtime lullabies and whispered encouragements something I fabricated because I needed to feel useful? I started watching other families. At the park. In the grocery store. At church. I watched older women hugged by their daughters, called Mama, thanked with real warmth. I wondered what I did wrong. What piece I missed. Was I too available? Too accommodating? Did I become so convenient that they stopped seeing me altogether? I don't know. All I know is that the hurts kept coming, small and sharp, like splinters you can't pull out. I was once asked to babysit overnight for a work trip. I said yes, of course. I always did. But when I arrived, Ava was already gone. No note. No check-in call. The fridge was nearly empty. I fed the baby what I could find, old applesauce and half a carton of almond milk, and sat up most of the night listening for a sound that never came. They returned late the next evening. No thank you. No question about how things went. Just a tired nod and a passing mention of how the hotel had terrible towels. That night, driving home in the dark, I pulled over just before my street and sat in the car with the engine running. I looked at my hands on the steering wheel, those same hands that once braided her hair, that once carried her through fevered nights and heartbreaks. And I wondered when they stopped being enough. I didn't cry. I haven't in years. But something inside me started to close. Some betrayals don't come with a raised voice or a slammed door. They arrive by mail. It was midsummer, the kind of day where the air feels thick enough to hold your breath hostage. I'd just come in from watering the lilies and set the kettle on when I saw the envelope tucked among the grocery coupons and lawn care flyers. Cream-colored. Heavy stock. My name handwritten in Ava's neat script. For a moment, I smiled. I thought it might be a thank you. Maybe an invitation. A soft gesture to patch over the slow unraveling between us. But it wasn't. It was a notice. A formal one. Typed, not personal. A transfer of custodial rights and emergency contact information for my granddaughter. Effective immediately, all school forms, medical decisions, and legal authority would fall to Ava's stepmother, Trish. There was no greeting. No signature. Just a note on the back in blue ink. Hope this simplifies things for you. You've done enough. I held the paper for a long while, unsure whether to sit or scream or simply dissolve. You've done enough. 3 words that could have meant anything. Or everything. I thought of the time I stayed up with Ava during her first bout of pneumonia, counting each raspy breath in the glow of a night light. I thought of the hours I sat in folding chairs at piano recitals, even when she barely touched the keys. The sandwiches I packed, the bills I covered without ever asking to be repaid. The secrets I kept when her marriage first cracked but she didn't want anyone to know. The way I held space for her sadness, her joy, her growing into something I couldn't always reach, but tried to honor. Now, it seemed, even the sliver of recognition I still held, the role of grandma who could be called in an emergency, was too much to ask. It wasn't about legal paperwork. I'm not foolish. I knew I didn't need custody or authority. I never wanted that. All I ever needed was the feeling that I mattered. That if my granddaughter fell, I would still be on the list of people who might catch her. But Ava had erased that quietly. With courtesy. With efficiency. Hope this simplifies things. It simplified me, certainly. Into an afterthought. I didn't respond. I placed the envelope in the drawer where I keep Paul's funeral program and our wedding certificate. A strange collection, maybe, beginnings and endings. Now joined by this quiet removal. For days, I floated in a fog. I went about my routine. Made my tea. Deadhead the roses. Went to church and smiled when someone asked about the baby. I said she was growing fast. That she had her mother's laugh. That was true, at least. The laugh, when I used to hear it. A week later, I saw Ava's announcement on Facebook. A little photo shoot, her daughter in a pale pink dress, surrounded by flowers and balloons. Introducing her second mom, the caption read, "No one better to help raise this angel." Trish stood beside them, beaming. I clicked the photo once. Then again. Not a single one included me. Not even in the blurred background. I didn't comment. I didn't react. I simply closed the browser. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the lights off and the window open. The crickets were loud. A neighbor's wind chime clinked every time the breeze stirred. I thought about calling. Not to fight. Just to ask. Just to hear Ava's voice. But then I thought, what would I even say? Why did you replace me? Why did you forget what I've been? Why did you sign away something I never claimed? I didn't dial. Instead, I reached for my checkbook. It was buried in the same drawer, the one with the envelope. I flipped it open and stared at the balances. I'd always been careful with money. Paul taught me that. We weren't wealthy, but we had enough. A small pension. A savings account I hadn't touched in years. And the house, still in my name. For decades, I'd planned to leave it all to Ava and, eventually, her daughter. That was the quiet plan. The unspoken promise. But as I looked at the figures, I felt a strange clarity settle over me. I had given my whole life without ledger or invoice. But that didn't mean value couldn't be measured. So I pulled a notepad from the drawer. The same one I used for grocery lists and recipes. And I began writing a different kind of list. Not what I'd given. Not what I was owed. Just names. A few women I'd known over the years. A cousin I hadn't seen since Paul's funeral. A friend from church who visited when I had shingles and left flowers on my porch. A neighbor boy who carried my bins up the driveway every Thursday without being asked. People who showed up. People who still saw me. I didn't make any decisions that night. But I knew something had changed. Not in anger. Not even in sorrow. But in the kind of silence that comes after a door closes softly. Not slammed, not locked, just gently shut. Some people burn bridges. I let mine weather quietly until they dissolved on their own. No announcement. No fury. Just silence. After that envelope, after the photos, the caption, the pretty little post, I stopped trying to reach for what no longer reached back. My phone, which used to light up every now and then with Ava's name, sat undisturbed on the kitchen counter. No missed calls. No texts. Not even a forwarded meme or a thinking of you in passing. I didn't chase. For the first time in years, I let the stillness wrap around me. Not as punishment, not for her, not for me, but as something truer than any conversation we might have had. Words can lie. Silence doesn't. At church, I took a new pew. Farther back. Fewer people asked about Ava or the baby. I didn't correct them when they assumed I had no children. I just smiled softly and turned my gaze toward the stained glass. I started walking more. Not for exercise, but to keep my thoughts from circling too tightly inside the house. Around the park, through the side streets where the lilacs were beginning to bloom. I noticed things I hadn't let myself linger on before. The sound of the neighbor's wind chime. The feel of gravel underfoot. The hush that comes when a sparrow lands near your bench and doesn't fly away. I also started writing. Not letters, I wasn't ready for that. But notes. Sentences that came to me in the early morning when the light stretched pale across the wallpaper. I kept them in a notebook, the same one I once reserved for family recipes and birthdays. Now it held a different kind of nourishment. Love is not ownership. She never asked if I was happy. I kept waiting for someone to say thank you, but maybe that was never their language. Each line a small release. A soft exhale of something I'd been holding too long. One afternoon, I opened the drawer again. The one with the envelope and the checkbook and the names I'd written on the notepad. I read through them slowly, remembering each face, each moment. A casserole dropped off when Paul passed. A ride home from the pharmacy when my hip was sore. A child's crayon drawing tucked into my mailbox just because. I didn't feel bitter. I felt grateful. These were the people who had seen me in quiet ways. Not because they had to, but because something in them still understood how to honor the invisible. I contacted a lawyer. Not a dramatic move. Just an appointment. She was kind, younger than I expected. She listened carefully as I spoke, never interrupting. I explained that I wanted to revisit my estate. I didn't offer much context, and she didn't press. Just nodded, made notes, and asked who I wanted listed. I gave her the names. The ones from the notepad. I left Ava and her daughter off. Not as revenge, but as honesty. They had made space in their lives for someone else to take the title I once carried. So I made space in mine for those who still carried me in return. When I left the office, it had started to rain. Just a drizzle, soft and steady. I walked the 4 blocks home without opening my umbrella. The rain felt cleansing. Not cold. Just real. Later that week, I went to the attic. It had been years. I climbed the steps slowly, holding the rail, careful on the uneven wood. The air was dry and filled with the soft dust of time. I opened boxes, baby clothes, photo albums, old letters tied with ribbon. I let the memories settle around me like fog. I didn't cry. But I did take one photo down. Ava at age 10, holding a kitten we'd rescued from the woods behind our house. Her face beaming, wild with joy. I held the frame for a long time. Then placed it in the donation pile. It's a strange thing, the way objects hold emotions long after people let go of them. But they also free you, when you're ready. One photo. One letter. One item at a time. That week, I also stopped answering invitations I knew weren't genuine. The ones that came last minute, or out of obligation. I declined a dinner at Ava's house, likely one arranged by Trish. I could imagine the tone of the message already, come by if you're free. No pressure. But it would have been pressure. The pressure to pretend. To nod and smile and eat salad while someone else rocked the baby and called themselves mom too. Instead, I made a roast for myself. Lit a candle. Played the record Paul gave me in '89, Ella Fitzgerald and Louis Armstrong. I sat alone, but not lonely. There's a difference. I wasn't punishing Ava. I was protecting myself. From being used. From being tolerated. From being forgotten in plain sight. Sometimes silence isn't a wall, it's a door. One you close softly, then turn to face the rest of the house you still have left. I began noticing more. The scent of coffee in the morning. The way my neighbor's boy always waved from his bike. The birdsong that changed with the hour. Life didn't feel big. But it felt mine again. And I didn't need anyone to call me grandma to know that I still had worth. I was learning how to be present for myself, in ways no one had taught me, because I'd been too busy being present for everyone else. The silence, I realized, was not empty. It was full of me. It's a peculiar thing, when you stop asking to be seen, you begin to see yourself. The silence I'd wrapped myself in, once a shield against pain, slowly became something else. A kind of clarity. Without the noise of expectation or the dull ache of waiting for a message that never came, I began to notice the corners of my life that I had let gather dust. Corners that hadn't been touched since Paul died, since Ava stopped calling regularly, since I quietly moved into the background of my own story. I started waking up earlier. Not for chores or anyone else's schedule, but for myself. I liked the light in the morning, the way it crept in through the lace curtains, patterning the floor like a secret language. I'd make tea and sit by the window, wrapped in Paul's old cardigan, letting the quiet settle over me like an old friend. I joined a local book circle. I hadn't read much for pleasure in years, too busy, too tired, too distracted. But the first book they chose was one I remembered loving when I was younger, something with wildflowers and a woman who ran away to find herself again. I sat in that circle, mostly listening at first. Women my age, a little younger, a little older. One had lost her husband last winter. Another was raising a grandson. We didn't talk about the past much, not at first. We talked about stories. But somehow, those stories made space for our own. I went back to the community garden where Paul and I used to volunteer. The plots had changed hands, but the soil still smelled the same, damp and hopeful. I asked if they needed help. A man named Clarence handed me gloves and pointed toward a row of overgrown herbs. I knelt, and for the first time in what felt like years, my hands worked the earth not in service of someone else, but for the sheer act of tending something. Each week, I returned. I planted rosemary, sage, lavender. I didn't tell Ava. I didn't need her to know. I also went to the bank and moved some funds into a separate account. Nothing drastic. Just a quiet shift. A redirection. I didn't touch the account yet. But having it felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had once been reserved entirely for someone else. The biggest change, though, came from the smallest moment. I was sitting on my front porch one afternoon, watching the mail truck crawl down the street. A girl from 2 houses down, maybe 8, maybe 9, was trying to fly a kite that kept tangling in the low branches of the oak tree. Her mother was inside yelling something I couldn't quite hear, and the girl looked frustrated, near tears. I stood, walked down the steps, and asked if I could help. We took the kite to the middle of the street where the wind was clearer. I held it high, told her to run when I said go, and on the 3rd try, it lifted. She laughed, a bubbling, surprised kind of sound, and turned to me with wide eyes. "Thanks, Grandma," she said, without thinking. She caught herself, apologized, but I waved her off. I wasn't hurt. I went back to the porch and watched the kite dip and soar. And I thought, maybe I didn't need blood to feel needed. Maybe I didn't need a title to matter. Later that week, I baked cookies, oatmeal raisin, and brought them down to her family. Not as a gesture, not for approval. Just because I had the time, and the recipe, and the memory of a laugh that stayed with me longer than any phone call had. Word must have gotten around. Within a few weeks, I had neighbors waving more, stopping to chat. One brought over cuttings from her garden. Another asked if I wanted to join her for a short hike. I started to feel known again, not as a role, but as a person. I moved differently, yes. But I also began to feel different. Not younger. Not lighter. But rooted. I donated some of Ava's old things. The sweaters she'd forgotten in my closet. The baby blanket I'd held onto just in case. I kept one photo on the mantle, Ava as a child, sitting on Paul's shoulders, both of them smiling so hard you could almost hear it. The rest I packed away. Not out of bitterness, but because I no longer needed the visual reminders of what had been. My memory was enough. And even that, I found, was beginning to soften at the edges, not erase, but blur, like the corners of a well-thumbed page. I had tea with my lawyer again. This time, to finalize some changes. I added new names. A scholarship fund. A donation to the community garden. A small trust for a boy at church whose mother worked 2 jobs and still managed to get him to Sunday school every week. People who still believed in showing up. In kindness. In quiet presence. I didn't tell anyone what I'd done. It wasn't about making a point. It was about making peace. Sometimes power doesn't look like slamming doors or issuing ultimatums. Sometimes it looks like lavender planted in early spring. Like a cup of tea made just for yourself. Like a bank account with no one else's name on it. I moved differently. And the world, in its own small way, began to move with me. I don't think absence feels like much at first. Not to the ones who have grown used to your presence. It's like background music, always there, soft enough to fade behind the noise of their own lives. Until it's gone. When I stopped showing up, I doubt Ava noticed immediately. My absence was easy to excuse, she was busy, the baby had colic, work deadlines piled up. I had trained her well in that way. I never demanded. I never reminded. I never said no. But over time, I imagine the silence began to press against the walls. I didn't bring over soup when her husband had the flu last fall. I heard through the grapevine, a mutual friend from church who still chatted with Ava on occasion. The kind of sickness that usually would have prompted me to arrive unannounced, groceries in hand, tea steeping in my thermos before I even rang the bell. But I didn't come. I didn't comment when her anniversary came and went without a card from me. I used to send one every year, always with a handwritten note reminding her of that rainy June day and the way her veil had caught in the church door and made us all laugh. This time, she got nothing. Small omissions, yes. But I had once been the keeper of her emotional calendar. The one who remembered. The one who showed up. Now I simply didn't. I stopped liking her photos online. I stopped sharing old memories. I stopped responding to the occasional forwarded article or group text that made its way to me. I didn't block her. I didn't delete her. But I allowed the space between us to grow, not from spite, but because it no longer made sense to pretend the connection was mutual. Months passed. I heard from someone at the pharmacy, an old friend of mine who works the register, that Ava had come in asking about my prescriptions. That she seemed surprised to learn I'd been filling them somewhere else. That I'd changed pharmacies altogether. I had. Quietly. Thoughtfully. And I'm sure it confused her. Because children don't expect their parents to shift. They believe we stay in place like porch lights, always there, always glowing, just in case they need to find their way home. But I had dimmed my light. Not out of cruelty. But because I realized I was only keeping it on for someone who no longer looked for it. At Thanksgiving, I didn't attend the family gathering. There had been no official invitation, but I'd been included in years past, often as the one who brought the pies or made the gravy or arrived early to peel potatoes and stay late to wash dishes. This year, I stayed home. I roasted a small chicken, not a turkey. I made stuffing with too much sage and cranberry sauce from scratch, the way Paul liked it. I played music, Ella and Louis again, and lit 2 candles. One for him. And one for the life I was beginning to reclaim. A week later, Ava called. I stared at the screen as her name blinked. For a moment, I didn't move. Then I let it ring. I watched the call pass through silence, vanish into voicemail, and leave nothing behind. She didn't leave a message. But 3 days after that, a card arrived. Folded in half, thick cardstock. No design. Just her handwriting, tight, a little uneven. Hope you're well. We missed you at Thanksgiving. No signature. No question. No warmth. I placed the card with the others I'd received that month, notes from neighbors, friends from the book circle, the woman from the garden who had dropped off a bouquet of cut lavender with a ribbon tied around it. Those cards were handwritten too. But you could feel the difference. Love leaves texture. Around Christmas, the cracks started to show. Trish sent out a holiday newsletter, one of those overly cheerful updates printed in bulk. She talked about family milestones. The baby's first steps, a promotion, a vacation to the coast. But there was no mention of me. Not even in passing. Someone from church forwarded me the letter, unsure if I'd seen it. I folded it twice and set it aside. Then I made a note in my estate file, remove address from shared family newsletter list. I heard, again through others, that Ava had been asking around. Have you seen my mom? Do you know how she's doing? That kind of thing. The inquiries of someone who had long assumed I'd always be orbiting, even if she stopped looking up. I wasn't angry. I had simply stepped out of orbit. And in that space, she began to feel the loss. It wasn't just my help she lost, though that, I imagine, was felt in missed babysitting, in holidays that took more effort, in meals that no longer cooked themselves. It was the deeper loss. The soft web of emotional safety I had spun around her for decades. The quiet knowledge that someone was always thinking of her. That someone remembered her favorite flowers. That someone cared whether or not she'd slept the night before. Without me, that cushion was gone. And with it, the illusion that love can be passive, that it can be placed on a shelf and pulled down only when needed. I had loved her wholly. But now, I loved myself too. And in choosing myself, I had become someone she could no longer take for granted. I don't know what she tells others. Maybe that I'm distant now. That I've become strange. Maybe she's rewritten the story in her own way, made me the one who withdrew, who changed. And maybe she's not wrong. I did change. I had to. Because if I hadn't, I would have disappeared completely. And this way, at least, I remained. Whole. Silent. Seen by those who bothered to look. Not everyone noticed. But she did. Eventually. It had been nearly a year since I last saw my granddaughter in person. I don't think anyone meant for it to be that long, but neglect stretches time. It takes root, grows slowly, and by the time you notice how much has passed, the season has already changed. I was sorting through old notebooks one afternoon, the ones I kept beside the telephone, filled with appointment times, grocery lists, little notes to myself. Some pages were barely touched. Others had doodles in the margins from when my hand itched for motion, for presence, for something more than silence. Near the back of one of the older ones, I found a folded sheet of paper, a letter I had started to write, but never finished. The date in the corner read February 2nd. My birthday. The ink was smudged near the edge, as though I'd held the pen too tightly or rested my hand too long while deciding what to say. I read it slowly. It was addressed to Ava. And it wasn't angry. It began with something like, "I don't expect you to understand this, but I want you to know what silence feels like." And then it stopped. Mid-sentence. As if even then, I knew there was no use in explaining something she hadn't yet learned how to hear. I sat with it for a long time. Let the weight of those unfinished words settle. Then I picked up a fresh page. Not to her. Not this time. This letter, the one that would change something in me, was to myself. I wrote it slowly, the way I'd learned to write again in those quiet months. Without the need for reply. Without the fear of judgment. Without editing myself into acceptability. "Dear Mary," it began. And I paused. Because that was new, saying my own name with tenderness. "Dear Mary, you gave everything without being asked. You carried the weight and never asked for thanks. You remembered every birthday. You noticed every ache in the voices of others. You offered your hands, your time, your sleep, your prayers. And when none of it was returned, you told yourself it was enough to simply give. But it wasn't. And that's not your fault. You were allowed to need softness, too. You were allowed to be held, remembered, called by name. You were not wrong to love. You were not weak to hope. But you are wiser now. You have seen what happens when love becomes one-sided, when presence becomes expected rather than cherished. You are not bitter. You are not cold. You are choosing yourself because no one else did when it mattered most. And now, with the time you have left, you are allowed, truly allowed, to pour that love into places that reflect it back. Into soil. Into strangers who become friends. Into quiet mornings with your tea and the knowledge that you do not need to be needed to matter. You matter because you are here. Still here. Still whole, even with the cracks. Signed with love, me. When I finished, I didn't cry. I read it once, then folded the paper neatly and tucked it into the small cedar box I keep near my bed. It used to hold Ava's childhood drawings. Crayon portraits of our house, stick figures with our names written underneath. Those were in a separate folder now, one I no longer opened as often. This letter belonged not to the past, but to the present. A kind of reclamation. A few weeks later, something unexpected arrived in the mail. A postcard. No return address. No message on the back, just a picture of a field of sunflowers. I knew instantly who it was from. Ava loved sunflowers when she was little. Drew them constantly. She once told me they looked like they were always looking for something. I didn't analyze the gesture. I didn't rush to respond. But I pinned it to the corkboard in the hallway, not as an invitation, but as a record. Some part of her remembered. It was enough. Not for reconciliation. Not yet. But for recognition. That something had been lost. And maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to feel the shape of that absence. Still, I didn't write back. Not because I didn't want to. But because I had already said what I needed to say, to the one person who had waited too long to hear it. Me. Some days I reread that letter when the house feels particularly quiet. Not out of sadness, but to remind myself of the distance I've traveled. The woman who wrote that unfinished birthday note is not the woman who rises now with the sun and walks the garden path barefoot just to feel the earth. The woman I've become no longer asks for space in anyone else's story. She is her own story now. And that is enough. The mornings are slower now. I wake before the sun sometimes, not because I have to, but because I want to. There's a stillness in those early hours that feels like a secret only I get to hold. The kettle whistles softly, and the house creaks like it's stretching its old bones alongside mine. I pad across the kitchen floor in slippers that have molded to the shape of my feet. The tea is always the same, chamomile with a pinch of honey. But somehow it tastes different each day, depending on what silence I've carried to the table. I sit near the window, the same one I've sat beside for years, but it feels changed. Not because of what's outside, the world goes on as it always has, but because I look through it differently now. There's no schedule. No obligation. No expectation of who I need to be for someone else. My days are my own. I tend to the garden most mornings. The lavender took better this year. The rosemary too, despite the dry spring. I kneel slowly, let the soil stain my hands, let the bees hover without flinching. It's not the kind of gardening I used to do when Paul was alive, rushing to pull weeds before a dinner party or fretting over which blooms would impress the neighbors. Now I garden like someone who's in no rush. I whisper to the earth, not because it needs my words, but because I need to remember I still have something to say. Ava hasn't called again. The postcard remains on the corkboard, slightly faded now. I don't look at it every day, but I haven't taken it down either. It reminds me of something I no longer chase, and that's its own kind of peace. Sometimes, I wonder what she tells her daughter about me. Whether I'm just a name mentioned in passing. Or maybe I've become a story, the grandmother who stepped away, who grew distant, who changed. But maybe, one day, when her daughter is older, she'll ask. Maybe she'll wonder why I wasn't there for certain things. And maybe Ava will pause before answering, a flicker of guilt passing through her voice. Maybe she'll say, I don't really know what happened. And that will be true. Because she didn't see it. She didn't see me slipping away one quiet omission at a time. Didn't feel the weight of my silence. Didn't notice the last casserole I delivered or the final gift I wrapped. That's the thing about soft love, it disappears without sound. But I notice now. I notice everything. The way the light bends over the bookshelf in the afternoon. The robin that visits the fence post at the same time each day. The warmth of fresh laundry folded just for me. The scent of lemon balm in my tea. The cool press of linen sheets at night. I keep a journal now. Not a dramatic one. Just lines and lines of what I notice. I write down the names of the flowers in bloom, the songs that come on the radio when I least expect them, the lines from books that feel like someone wrote them just for me. I even wrote about the baptism once. Just a few sentences. It was a beautiful ceremony. The child wore lace. There were doves carved into the windows. I was not mentioned. And that told me everything I needed to know. I closed the notebook after that and let the page stay. No need to rewrite it. Some truths are best left plain. The neighbors know me now. Better than they used to. The little girl with the kite still waves when she sees me. Her mother invited me for lemonade last weekend. We sat on lawn chairs and watched the kids try to catch fireflies. I laughed, truly laughed, when one of them shouted, "They're magic, just slower." It felt good to be in a moment without wondering if I was taking up space I wasn't welcome in. There's a freedom in being nobody's obligation. And there's a deep, quiet beauty in becoming your own sanctuary. I donated the last of Ava's things last week. There were still a few boxes in the attic. Baby shoes. An old music box. Some cards from when she was in college. I held each one for a moment before letting it go. Not with sadness. Just with finality. I kept a scarf. One she gave me long ago, before the forgetting began. It's soft, pale blue, with little embroidered flowers near the edges. I drape it over my shoulders sometimes when I sit outside. It doesn't mean I forgive everything. It just means I remember there was once warmth between us. And that counts for something. A woman from my book circle brought over a pie the other day. Just because, she said, setting it gently on the table like a gift. I looked at her, this woman I didn't even know a year ago, and felt something shift. The world hasn't stopped offering kindness. You just have to be willing to receive it from different hands. I've started humming again. In the kitchen. In the garden. Even when folding laundry. Old songs. Bits of melodies that once lulled Ava to sleep. I don't hum them for her now. I hum them for myself. Because they still live in me. And I'm allowed to keep the music, even if the audience is gone. My life is quiet now. Not empty. Not lonely. Just quiet. Filled with birdsong and lavender and a softness I built with my own hands. And that's enough. I wasn't angry. I was finally empty, and that was beautiful. Last week, I walked through my home with a box under one arm and a pen in the other. Not hurried. Not tearful. Just present. I stopped at each room, letting my eyes trace the shelves, the corners, the frames on the walls. I was deciding what would stay and what would go. It wasn't a purge. I've never been reckless with memory. But there's something freeing in choosing. Not out of spite or pain, but out of readiness. I didn't want to leave this house one day with drawers full of unsorted ghosts. In the hallway closet, I found an old photo album. The kind with yellowed pages and plastic sleeves that crackle when turned. It was from when Ava was about 5. Her birthday party at the park, balloons tied to the bench, a cake I stayed up past midnight to bake. I looked at my own face in one of the group shots. I was laughing. Fully. The kind of laugh that lifts your whole chest and squints your eyes. Paul's hand rested gently on my shoulder, and Ava's arms were looped around my neck. I let myself feel it. Not as a loss, but as proof. I loved her. I loved them both. And for a time I was loved in return. I kept that album. But I gave away the second one, the one that stopped being filled around the time Ava began forgetting my birthday. It held only half a story, and I didn't need to carry the weight of its empty pages. The next day, I called my lawyer again. Not to undo anything. Just to update. There was one last name I wanted to add to the fund, the little girl with the kite, Emma. I asked if a provision could be made for her education, should she ever need it. A modest one. Nothing flashy. Just enough to be felt when it matters most. Because sometimes, the people who aren't born into your story are the ones who arrive when it counts. And sometimes, giving to them feels more like legacy than inheritance ever did. I've also been writing letters. One to Paul. One to Ava. One to the child I once was. They're not meant to be sent. They're folded neatly and placed in envelopes, tucked into a box beneath the lavender sachets in my drawer. I told Paul the first miss him differently now, less with tears, more with memory. I told Ava I still think of her every time I see a sunflower. And I told the younger me. The girl who gave too much, who waited too long, who feared being forgotten, that she turned out all right. That she didn't disappear. That she became something solid. Not in someone else's arms, but in her own. These letters aren't closure. They're acknowledgements. A soft way of saying, I see you. I see what you carried. I see what you gave. And now I see what you kept for yourself, too. A few nights ago, I sat out on the porch wrapped in the pale blue scarf Ava gave me long ago. The wind was warm. The stars were out. And from the house next door, I could hear Emma giggling through the open windows. A lullaby played faintly behind her voice. I didn't know the tune, but it reminded me of something. Of rocking chairs. Of bedtime stories. Of nights when I was still needed. I didn't ache. I just listened. When the lights dimmed next door and the laughter gave way to quiet, I closed my eyes and breathed in deep. There was nothing I wished undone. The years of sacrifice. The years of silence. The moment in the church with the program in my lap and my name left off. Even that. Because everything I walked through brought me here, to this peace, this steadiness, this life of my own making. I may not be remembered in stories told at future birthdays. My name may not be passed down with heirlooms. But I will be known in smaller ways. In a garden that blooms every spring. In a bank account that helps a child go to school. In the rhythm of a woman's day who finally learned she was enough. That's the thing no one tells you when you're raising others, when your love becomes labor, when your joy becomes a shadow behind theirs. No one tells you that one day, you can raise yourself too. And it's not too late. Not at 70. Not ever. I still write. In my notebook, in the letters, in the margins of library books I return weeks early just so someone else can find the words I've underlined. I still walk. Not fast. But far enough to feel the sky shift. I still sing sometimes when I think no one can hear me. And in all of that, I am still here. Not waiting. Not retreating. Just living. And when I'm gone, truly gone, I hope what remains isn't bitterness or confusion or a tangle of missed calls. I hope it's the scent of lavender. The memory of a soft scarf. A line in a journal that says, she wasn't loud. But she was there. Even when they stopped seeing her, she stayed, until she didn't. And she left not with fury, but with freedom.